I love video game music, and I've always seen it as one of the most underrated parts of video games. Growing up around music, I would constantly see it put down by teachers and classmates, and while anyone who actually cares to listen to some music would know they're wrong, it's hard to argue with them. While the visual media like photography, film, and animation that would later inspire video game visuals are approaching a century of history, the audio behind games is still relatively new. Since storage limitations were so tight in consoles like the NES, developers had to make do with the methods they could fit on a cartridge, and these methods would go on to haunt the industry as practically a stereotype. But how hard really were those methods to do? Is the stigma around them warranted? And how did the beginning of video game music change the industry for the rest of time? Today, let's look back on the NES to answer these questions in the very first episode of Chiptunes. So let's get a few things out of the way first. We're going to be talking about the NES today, and specifically looking into the audio. Now, Nintendo has a prolonged history of scrubbing their patents and all of their other information as soon as they can. So there's actually not that much information that's out and available for people to read. I would say, for starters, if you're looking into some information about this, a great place to start is the Video Game Music Preservation Foundation. It's a wiki with a ton of information behind it, and it's a great starting point for looking into some of this stuff. That said, because a lot of this information is on sites that either no longer have their domains renewed or they just don't exist anymore, it's nearly impossible to replicate visuals nowadays. So, I'm going to be citing a few channels in the bottom left corner for this specific dive into the NES. But why are we starting at the NES? I mean, there's a whole library of games that came before the NES era. Well, to put it simply, while games like Pong, Galaxian, and the Oregon Trail were around, their music, how do I put this politely? Their music wasn't. Now, beeps and boops were more than serviceable for the time, but the NES was where music was actually present in the game, and pleasant. That's the important part as well. It's also where a lot of the stereotypes and stigma come from. You can probably think some of them up too. Everyone knows that person who says that it's just Tetris or Mario music, and that you can just learn it on a recorder in a few minutes, and while that's wrong, which it is, it's definitely easy to see that mentality. NES music at the time was very simplistic, usually only having one or two musical lines, maybe, and a bass line. And while there's a reason for that, and we'll get into it, it is worth acknowledging that there is a precedent for people feeling this way. Now let's completely destroy that precedent and break this down. The first question that pops into people's minds is, how do we make music for the NES? Presumably, you would just make the music and put the files in the cartridges, right? Well, not really. You see, NES cartridges could only hold around 1 megabyte of storage, so any file would have to be bytes at the most to be able to fit your whole game. Like I said earlier, storage limitations were a huge problem for game devs at the time, so they had to work with what they had. They could make an entire game that's as small as humanly possible, and they still wouldn't be able to fit a tiny soundtrack on there. So, how'd they do it? It sounds a lot simpler than it is. You see, while file limitations were too small to put full music into the game, it was big enough to put the instructions for that music that the NES's built-in Soundchip could understand. What this means is that while you couldn't put the music in the game, you could tell the synthesizer what noises to make when, and where. And tell them they did. This is the main method that NES games were composed with, and it completely defined the sound of video games. Now let's break down how this works. What you're looking at right now is a visual representation of the MIDI player in an NES game playing. As you can see, there are 4 channels represented. On the top 2 channels, you have square waves. These are typically where the moving lines are, including the main melody and the counter melody. As you can see, it's also why there's typically only 1 or 2 main musical ideas happening at once, at least in the melody. On the bottom left, the 3rd channel produces triangle, or sawtooth waves. You're probably noticing the pattern with them. It's all about the shape. Anyway, these waves were typically used for bassier parts of the music, including backgrounds and other low parts. Low register aside, they're just as versatile as the last 2. The last one, however, in my opinion, is the most interesting out of all of them. Unlike the others, which are trying to be musical, as synthesized as they are, the 4th channel is just for white noise, and that's it. Why would I want my synthesizer to intentionally play white noise, you may be asking? Well, believe it or not, it's actually the percussion. If you listen to the track on its own, you can definitely hear the crunch from the noise, but if you're playing the game, it's gonna sound just like a snare drum. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, as you're playing the game, your cartridge is telling the sound chip that in X situation, it's going to make Y sound. So when you're crossing that bridge in Final Fantasy, the game's telling the sound chip, hey, it's time to play the Final Fantasy theme. And it works the same way for Mario, Zelda, Metroid. All of them use the exact same techniques. But regardless of what sound it is, the system's designed to facilitate every noise you could possibly need just on the one sound chip. And as you're playing the NES, whether it's Final Fantasy, Mario, Metroid, or Zelda, or whatever else in the library, you might not even notice that you're hearing the same sounds across each game, but in different ways. In a way, it almost becomes more like programming than it does composition in the traditional sense, and it's really cool. This monumental feat of composition and engineering created these easy-to-sing, easy-to-listen-to tracks that essentially became the sound of gaming. But it also became a stigma that follows the industry to this day. Whether it's an old school title or the newest thing on the block, game music will always have its detractors, but it's being more accepted as time goes on. The 8-Bit Big Band won a Grammy this year. John Batiste has been championing game music for years, and the industry is more diverse than ever before. So long as people are still listening to it, video game music will continue to evolve, and I'll be here cheering it on every step of the way. Thank you for watching. This is going to be the start of a brand new series where we're going to be championing music, telling the stories about certain games, or getting information out there. There's a lot of misconceptions about the video game industry, especially its music, and I want to tell those stories. Some episodes are going to be super informative, like this one will be, others are going to be more opinion-based, but I'm going to be here championing video game music till the day I die. Thanks for watching.